The laughing begins. The morning sun beat down on the dusty military training range in Nevada. Chuck Norris stepped out of his rental car, wearing simple jeans and a black t-shirt. At 42 years old, he had already made his mark as a marshal, arts champion, and action movie star. Today, he was visiting Fort Carson to research his next film role as a military sniper. The range was buzzing with activity. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms were setting up targets at various distances. Some were cleaning their rifles while others practiced breathing techniques. Chuck walked toward the registration booth, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Name?" asked the sergeant behind the desk, barely looking up from his clipboard. "Chuck Norris," came the reply. The sergeant's head snapped up, his eyes widening. Within seconds, word had spread across the range like wildfire. Soldiers began gathering, some openly staring, others whispering among themselves. Chuck could hear fragments of their conversations. "That's the guy from those karate movies," one young private muttered to his buddy. "Yeah, but what's he doing here?" "This isn't a movie set," another responded with a smirk. A group of seasoned marksmen had been practicing at the 800-meter range. These were some of the military's finest shooters, men who had trained for years to perfect their craft. When they saw Chuck approaching with a borrowed rifle, quiet chuckles began to ripple through their ranks. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a veteran with over 15 years of shooting experience, couldn't help but grin. "Boys, looks like Hollywood thinks shooting is as easy as throwing a punch," he said loud enough for others to hear. The laughter started small but grew as more soldiers joined in. They weren't being malicious, but there was definitely an air of superiority. These men had dedicated their lives to precision shooting. They had trained in all weather conditions under stress, with adrenaline pumping through their veins. The idea that an actor could walk onto their range and compete with them seemed almost insulting. Chuck heard the comments but remained calm. He had faced skepticism before in martial arts tournaments, where fighters dismissed him until they found themselves on the mat. This situation felt familiar, though the stakes were different. "Mr. Norris," called out Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the range officer, "I understand you're here for research purposes. We're happy to accommodate you, but I should warn you that military precision shooting is quite different from movie stunts." Chuck nodded respectfully. "I appreciate that, sir. I'm here to learn." As Chuck set up at the firing line, more soldiers gathered behind him. The whispers continued, and some were making bets about how badly he would miss. The target was set at 600 meters, a challenging distance even for experienced military marksmen. "Give him the old rifle," someone joked from the back of the crowd. "The one with the bent scope." More laughter erupted. Chuck adjusted the rifle, checking its weight and balance. He had actually spent considerable time training with firearms for his movies, but he had never attempted precision shooting at this distance under the scrutiny of professional soldiers. The range fell relatively quiet as Chuck took his position. He could feel dozens of eyes on him waiting for him to fail. Some soldiers had their arms crossed, others were barely containing their amusement. A few had started making quiet jokes about Hollywood actors playing soldier. What none of them knew was that Chuck had been secretly training with a retired Marine sniper for the past 6 months, preparing for this exact type of scenario. He had learned to control his breathing, to read wind patterns, and to squeeze the trigger with mathematical precision. But he kept this information to himself. As Chuck settled into his shooting stance, the laughter began to die down slightly. The soldiers could see that his form wasn't completely amateur. His breathing was controlled, his grip was steady, and his eye alignment looked professional. "Maybe he won't embarrass himself completely," Rodriguez whispered to his partner. But the skepticism remained strong. These soldiers had seen countless civilians attempt military-style shooting, and the results were usually disappointing. They expected Chuck to miss the target entirely, or perhaps hit the outer rings at best. Chuck closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the crowd. He thought about all the hours he had spent on private ranges, all the instruction he had received, all the mental preparation. When he opened his eyes, his focus was laser-sharp. The target seemed to stare back at him across the 600 meters of desert terrain. Wind was minimal, conditions were perfect. Chuck took a deep breath, released half of it, and began to apply pressure to the trigger. The crowd behind him had grown to nearly 50 soldiers, all waiting to see the famous action star fail at their profession. Some had their phones out, ready to record what they expected would be an amusing miss. None of them noticed the lone figure standing apart from the crowd, observing silently from the shade of a nearby building. This man wore no visible rank insignia, just simple military fatigues. His weathered face showed no expression as he watched Chuck prepare for the shot. This observer had been at the range for his own training session when the commotion started. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing. Something about Chuck's stance, his breathing pattern, and his grip told a different story. This man had seen enough real shooters to recognize the signs of genuine training. As Chuck's finger tightened on the trigger, the mysterious observer stepped slightly closer, his experienced eyes noting every detail of the setup. He had a feeling that the laughing soldiers were about to learn something important about making assumptions. The shot that changed everything. The crack of the rifle echoed across the desert range, causing several soldiers to flinch. Chuck held his position for a moment, following through with perfect form before slowly lowering the weapon. The crowd behind him had fallen completely silent. Through his binoculars, Sergeant Rodriguez focused on the target 600 meters away. His confident smirk disappeared instantly. "Holy," he started, then caught himself. "That's a bullseye. Dead center." A murmur ran through the crowd, but the disbelief was obvious. Several soldiers grabbed their own binoculars to verify what Rodriguez had seen. One by one, their expressions changed from amusement to shock. "Must be a lucky shot," someone called out, though the voice lacked conviction. Chuck stood up, brushing dust from his jeans. His face remained calm, showing no signs of surprise or celebration. "Could I try another one?" he asked the range officer. "Lieutenant." Colonel Patterson nodded, still staring at the confirmed bullseye through his scope. "Of course, Mr. Norris, take your time." The crowd grew larger as word spread across the base. Soldiers from other parts of the range began migrating over to see what was happening. Chuck reloaded and settled back into position, this time with complete silence from his audience. The mysterious observer moved closer, positioning himself where he could better study Chuck's technique. Something about the actor's movements seemed familiar, professional in a way that suggested real training rather than movie preparation. Chuck's second shot took longer to set up. He adjusted for a slight wind shift that most of the watching soldiers hadn't even noticed. When he fired, the report seemed even louder in the hushed atmosphere. "Another bullseye," Rodriguez announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "This one's even more centered than the first." The laughter had completely stopped. Conversations became hushed, respectful. Several of the soldiers who had been making jokes earlier now looked embarrassed, shuffling their feet and avoiding eye contact with their buddies. "3 more?" asked Chuck, looking at the range officer. Patterson nodded numbly. He had been running this range for 8 years and had seen thousands of shooters. Very few could place 2 consecutive bullseyes at 600 meters, especially not on their first visit to his range. Chuck's third shot came faster. His confidence was building and the rhythm felt natural. The rifle seemed to be an extension of his body now. When the shot broke, he didn't even need to check the target. He knew it was perfect. "Jesus," whispered a young corporal. 3 for 3. The fourth shot was taken with mechanical precision. Chuck had found his zone, that mental space where outside distractions disappeared and only the target existed. His breathing was controlled, his heartbeat steady. The trigger squeeze was smooth and consistent. 4 bullseyes. By now the crowd had grown to over 100 soldiers. Word had spread to other parts of the base, and people were arriving just to witness this unexpected demonstration. Even some officers had gathered, their initial skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. The mysterious observer finally stepped forward from his position in the shadows. As he approached, several soldiers noticed him and straightened slightly. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, though his uniform bore no visible rank or unit identifiers. Chuck prepared for his 5th and final shot. The pressure was building, but it felt familiar. In martial arts competitions, he had learned to perform under scrutiny, to block out distractions and focus solely on execution. This situation was similar but required different skills. As he settled into his shooting stance, Chuck noticed the new arrival approaching. The man moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged on this range, someone who understood the technical aspects of precision shooting. "Interesting technique," the man said quietly, just loud enough for Chuck to hear. His accent was British, refined, but with an edge that suggested military background. Chuck glanced up briefly, noting the man's weathered features and alert eyes. "Thank you," he replied simply, then returned his focus to the target. The fifth shot was the most important. Chuck knew that 4 consecutive bullseyes could still be dismissed as luck or favorable conditions. 5 would prove that his performance was intentional and repeatable. He controlled his breathing, feeling his heart rate slow. The crosshairs settled on the center of the target, steady and true. His finger found the trigger's sweet spot, applying pressure gradually and consistently. The shot broke clean, and Chuck knew immediately that it was perfect. He didn't need binoculars to confirm what everyone else was about to discover. 5 bullseyes, Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent range. 5 consecutive bullseyes at 600 meters. The crowd erupted in applause, but it was respectful rather than celebratory. These soldiers understood the difficulty of what they had just witnessed. Their earlier mockery had been replaced by genuine admiration for skill, regardless of who was demonstrating it. Chuck stood and safed his rifle, handing it back to the armorer with a nod of thanks. Several soldiers approached to congratulate him, their previous skepticism completely gone. "Mr. Norris," called Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, "that was exceptional shooting. Where did you learn those skills?" Before Chuck could answer, the British voice spoke again. "If I may," the mysterious man said, stepping fully into the group. "Those weren't lucky shots. That was the work of someone who has received proper training." All eyes turned to the newcomer, who had remained largely unnoticed. Until now, his presence seemed to change the atmosphere on the range, adding a layer of tension that hadn't existed before. "And you are?" Patterson asked, though something in his tone suggested he might already know the answer. The man smiled slightly, but his eyes remained serious. "Someone who recognizes real skill when he sees it," he replied cryptically. "Mr. Norris, I believe we should talk." Chuck nodded, intrigued by this unexpected development. The soldiers around them seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold, though none of them could have predicted exactly what that would be. The mysterious stranger reveals himself. The crowd of soldiers gradually dispersed, returning to their own training exercises with animated discussions about what they had witnessed. Chuck and the mysterious British man walked toward a quieter section of the range, away from curious ears. "Impressive display," the man said as they reached a bench overlooking the desert landscape. "But I suspect there's more to your story than movie research." Chuck studied his companion carefully. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and scars that spoke of real combat experience. His eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen violence and survived it. "I've been training privately," Chuck admitted. 6 months with a retired Marine sniper named Bob Henderson. He said I had natural ability but needed proper instruction. The man nodded knowingly. "Henderson's a good teacher. Served with him, briefly in Vietnam. He only works with students he believes have real potential." "How do you know Bob?" Chuck asked, increasingly curious about this stranger who seemed to know everyone and everything. "Professional circles tend to be small," came the cryptic reply. "My name is David Sterling. I work for the British government in various capacities." Chuck sensed there was much more to Sterling's story, but he didn't push for details. In his R experience, people revealed what they wanted to reveal when they were ready. "Your shooting today was technically sound," Sterling continued, "but technique is only part of what makes a real sniper. The mental game is equally important, and that's harder to teach." "Mental game?" Chuck asked, genuinely interested. Sterling stood and walked to the edge of the firing line, gesturing toward the distant targets. "Anyone can hit a bullseye on a calm day with no pressure. Real snipers have to perform when lives depend on it. When they're exhausted, when the weather is terrible, when someone is shooting back. As if on cue, a gust of wind kicked up dust across the range. Sterling continued his explanation. I've been watching military snipers train for over 20 years. Most of them are good soldiers and decent shooters, but very few have what it takes to operate in truly hostile environments, where one shot can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Chuck was intrigued by Sterling's intensity and obvious expertise. What makes the difference? Mental, conditioning, the ability to remain calm under extreme stress. Most people's hands shake when their adrenaline spikes. Their breathing becomes irregular. Their vision narrows. A real sniper learns to use that adrenaline, to channel it into enhanced focus, rather than letting it become a distraction. Sterling paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There's a reason I approached you today, Mr. Norris. Your performance wasn't just technically impressive, it was mentally impressive. You handled the pressure of that crowd, the skepticism, the expectations. That's unusual for someone with only 6 months of training. I've been performing under pressure most of my life, Chuck replied. Martial, arts tournaments, movie sets with dozens of people watching. I guess the skills transfer. Indeed they do. Sterling turned to face Chuck directly. Which brings me to why I'm really here. The range had grown quieter as the afternoon progressed. Most of the regular training had concluded, leaving only a few soldiers conducting maintenance on equipment. Chuck and Sterling had relative privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. I'm not just here for casual observation, Sterling continued. I'm evaluating potential candidates for a very specialized program. We occasionally need people with unique skill sets for operations that regular military personnel can't handle. Chuck felt a chill of anticipation. This conversation was heading somewhere he hadn't expected when he woke up that morning. What kind of operations? He asked carefully. Sterling was quiet for a long moment, apparently deciding how much to reveal. The kind where conventional approaches don't work, where we need someone who can blend into civilian environments, who has skills that enemy forces wouldn't expect. Are you recruiting me for something? I'm exploring possibilities, Sterling replied diplomatically. Your public profile provides perfect cover. Nobody expects an action movie star to be conducting real operations. It's the kind of misdirection that intelligence services dream about. Chuck processed this information carefully. His instincts told him that Sterling was legitimate, but the implications were enormous. This sounds like something out of a spy novel. Sterling smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Reality is often stranger than fiction, Mr. Norris. The question is whether you'd be interested in making your fiction a bit more real. Before Chuck could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. 3 black SUVs were driving across the desert toward their position, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. Sterling's demeanor changed instantly, becoming more alert and focused. That's my ride, he said, checking his watch. I have to go, but this conversation isn't over. The vehicles pulled up nearby and several men in dark suits emerged. They moved with the same quiet confidence as Sterling, clearly cut from similar cloth, Mr. Norris, Sterling said as he prepared to leave. If you're interested in learning more about real-world applications for your skills, contact me through Bob Henderson. He knows how to reach me. Chuck stood as Sterling walked toward the waiting vehicles. What exactly are you offering, Sterling? Paused at the door of the lead SUV. A chance to find out what you're really capable of, he called back, and perhaps an opportunity to serve your country in ways that go beyond entertainment. The vehicles departed as quickly as they had arrived, leaving Chuck alone with his thoughts and a dozen new questions. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and red. As he walked back toward his rental car, Chuck reflected on the day's events. He had come to the range expecting to research a movie role and ended up receiving a shooting lesson and a mysterious job offer from what appeared to be a British intelligence operative. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his agent, asking about progress on the movie research. Chuck stared at the message for a moment, then put the phone away without responding. Suddenly, The fictional world of movie-making seemed far less interesting than the possibilities Sterling had hinted at. The drive back to his hotel gave Chuck time to think. His martial arts background had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about David Sterling felt authentic and important. The man clearly had access to information and resources that suggested genuine government connections. But taking Sterling's offer seriously would mean entering a world that Chuck knew nothing about, where the stakes would be real and the consequences potentially deadly. It was one thing to perform movie stunts with safety measures and multiple takes. It was another entirely to operate in genuine danger zones where mistakes couldn't be fixed in post-production. The call that changed everything. 3 weeks passed before Chuck made the call. He had spent those days finishing his current movie project, but his mind kept returning to his conversation with David Sterling. Finally, on a quiet Thursday evening, he dialed Bob Henderson's number. "Chuck?" Bob's gravelly voice answered after 2 rings. "How did the range visit go?" "Interesting," Chuck replied. "I met someone there who said he knew you." "David Sterling?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Bob spoke again, his tone had changed completely. "Where are you right now?" "At home." "Why?" "Stay there. I'm coming over. Don't discuss this on the phone." Bob arrived an hour later, his expression more serious than Chuck had ever seen it. The retired Marine had trained Chuck with patience and humor for 6 months, but tonight he looked like a man carrying heavy burdens. "Sterling contacted you?" Bob asked as soon as Chuck closed the door behind him. "He said to reach him through you if I was interested in learning more about real-world applications for my shooting skills." Bob moved to the window, checking the street outside before closing the blinds. His caution made Chuck realize just how deep this situation might go. "David Sterling is not someone you meet by accident," Bob said, settling into Chuck's living room chair. "He's one of the most effective operatives the British SAS has ever produced. If he approached you, it's because he has something specific in mind." Chuck poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to Bob. "What kind of something?" "The kind that gets people killed if they're not careful," Bob replied grimly. "But also the kind that saves lives and serves important purposes. Sterling doesn't recruit civilians unless the situation is extraordinary." Bob took a long sip of his bourbon before continuing. "I've worked with him twice. Once in Cambodia, once in El Salvador. Both times, conventional military operations had failed and diplomatic solutions were impossible. Sterling specializes in the gaps between official policy and necessary action. Are you saying he's some kind of government assassin?" "I'm saying he solves problems that governments can't officially solve. Sometimes that involves eliminating threats, but more often it involves intelligence gathering, hostage rescue, or disrupting enemy operations. The methods vary depending on the mission." Chuck absorbed this information while studying his old instructor's face. Bob had never spoken about his military service in such detail, but tonight seemed different. "He mentioned using my public profile as cover," Chuck said. Bob nodded. "That makes sense. Celebrity status opens doors that intelligence operatives can't access. People invite movie stars to parties, events, private meetings. They don't suspect actors of having military training or government connections. But what would he want me to do exactly? That depends on what missions he's facing. Could be anything from gathering information at diplomatic functions to more direct action if the situation requires it." Bob's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. He glanced at the caller ID and his expression grew even more serious. "It's Sterling," he said quietly. "Speak of the devil." Bob answered the call, mostly listening and occasionally responding with brief affirmatives. Chuck could hear the urgency in Sterling's voice through the speaker, though he couldn't make out the specific words. "Understood," Bob said finally. "We'll be ready." He ended the call and immediately began dialing another number. "What's happening?" Chuck asked. "Sterling's in Los Angeles. He wants to meet tonight, says there's a time-sensitive situation that requires immediate attention." Bob's second call was even briefer. "It's me," he said when someone answered. "We need a clean location for a sensitive meeting. Tonight, 3 people." He listened for a moment, then hung up. "Get your jacket," Bob told Chuck. "We're going for a ride." They drove through the Hollywood Hills to a small, nondescript office building that appeared closed for the evening. Bob led Chuck to a side entrance where a security guard was waiting to let them in without questions. The elevator took them to the third floor, where David Sterling was waiting in a conference room with maps spread across a large table. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Gentlemen," Sterling said, standing to shake hands, "thank you for coming on short notice. We have a situation." Chuck studied the maps while Sterling organized his materials. They appeared to show various locations in Eastern Europe, with red marks indicating specific sites. 3 days ago, Sterling began, a team of international weapons inspectors was taken hostage in a former Soviet facility in Ukraine. The kidnappers are demanding the release of certain prisoners and threatening to execute the hostages if their demands aren't met within 72 hours. Chuck felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer theoretical discussion about potential future operations. "Official rescue attempts are politically impossible," Sterling continued. "The facility is in disputed territory, and any military action by NATO forces could trigger a larger conflict. Diplomatic negotiations have stalled because the kidnappers don't trust government representatives." "Where do I fit into this?" Chuck asked. Sterling pointed to a photograph on the table. "The leader of the kidnapping group is a man named Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz, now working as a mercenary. Intelligence suggests he's a fan of American action movies, particularly your films." Chuck stared at the photograph, trying to process what Sterling was suggesting. "We need someone who can approach Kozlov as a civilian, someone he might agree to meet based on curiosity or admiration, someone who could potentially get close enough to assess the hostage situation and create opportunities for rescue." "You want me to walk into a hostage situation and pretend I'm there for a movie meeting?" "Essentially, yes. We've prepared cover stories about a film production company scouting locations in the region. Kozlov has been contacted through intermediaries about the possibility of meeting a famous American actor who's researching a new military thriller." Bob leaned forward. "What kind of support would Chuck have?" "Full tactical backup positioned nearby, but out of sight. Communications equipment, extraction plans, emergency protocols. But the initial contact would have to be Chuck alone, or Kozlov will never agree to the meeting." Chuck walked to the window, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline while considering Sterling's proposal. Everything in his life had been preparation for fictional conflicts, choreographed fight scenes, and carefully planned stunts. This was asking him to step into real danger with real consequences. "How much time do I have to decide?" he asked. Sterling checked his watch. "The flight to Eastern Europe leaves in 6 hours. If you're coming, we need to begin mission preparation immediately." Chuck turned back to face both men. Bob's expression was neutral, offering no guidance either way. Sterling watched intently, clearly hoping for a positive response but prepared for refusal. "If I do this," Chuck said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that I'll make it out alive?" "None," Sterling replied honestly. "But 5 innocent people will definitely die if we do nothing. And you're the only person we've identified who might be able to get close enough to help them." Into the lion's den, Chuck found himself on a military transport plane 12 hours later, flying over the Atlantic Ocean toward an uncertain fate. The cargo hold contained specialized equipment and 3 other operatives who would provide backup, support from a distance. Sterling sat across from him, reviewing mission details for the 4th time. "Remember, you're Chuck Norris, the actor researching locations for a new action film. You know nothing about military tactics or weapons beyond what you've learned for movies. Stay in character no matter what you see or hear." Chuck nodded, though. His stomach churned with nervous energy. The past day had been a whirlwind of briefings, equipment training, and psychological preparation. Nothing could have prepared him for the reality of flying toward genuine danger. "The facility is an abandoned weapons research station from the 1980s, Sterling continued. "Kozlov's group has been using it as a base for 6 months. Intelligence suggests they have between 8 and 12 armed men, plus the 5 hostages." The Yao plane began its descent toward a small airfield in Poland. where they would transfer to civilian vehicles for the drive to the Ukrainian border. Chuck watched the Eastern European countryside pass below, knowing that somewhere in that landscape, 5 innocent people were counting on his ability to improvise and survive. 2 days later, Chuck sat in the passenger seat of a rented Mercedes, approaching the coordinates Sterling had provided. His driver was a local contact who spoke minimal English but knew the terrain. Hidden in Chuck's clothing were a tiny communications device and a tracking beacon that would allow Sterling's team to monitor his location. The abandoned facility appeared on the horizon like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. Concrete buildings surrounded by rusted fences and overgrown vegetation. Several vehicles were parked near the main entrance, suggesting significant activity inside. Chuck's driver stopped at a checkpoint where 2 armed guards approached the car. One of them recognized Chuck immediately, his eyes widening with excitement. After a brief conversation in Russian, they waved the Mercedes through the gates. The main building's interior had been partially renovated, with modern furniture and equipment mixed among the Soviet-era fixtures. Armed men moved through the hallways with professional efficiency, clearly experienced soldiers rather than common criminals. Viktor Kozlov met Chuck in what had once been the facility's main conference room. He was a large man with intelligent eyes and numerous scars that spoke of extensive combat experience. Despite the circumstances, he seemed genuinely pleased to meet his famous visitor. "Mr. Norris," Kozlov said in heavily accented English, "this is incredible honor. I have watched all your films many times." Chuck forced himself to smile and shake Kozlov's hand, playing the role of a celebrity meeting an enthusiastic fan. "Thank Yao. You. I understand you might be able to help with location scouting for my new film." For the next hour, Kozlov gave Chuck a tour of the facility, clearly proud of his temporary headquarters. Chuck memorized every detail he could about guard positions, weapons, and potential escape routes, all while maintaining casual conversation about movie making. During the tour, Chuck glimpsed 3 of the hostages through an open doorway. They appeared unharmed but obviously frightened. He made mental notes of their location and the security measures surrounding them. "Your new film?" Kozlov asked over dinner. "It will show Russian soldiers in positive way? Too many Hollywood movies make us look like villains." Chuck nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. I want to show the human side of military professionals regardless of their nationality. That's why authentic locations like this are so important." Kozlov seemed satisfied with this response. As the evening progressed, Chuck began to understand the man's psychology. He was intelligent, well-educated, and genuinely passionate about military history and tactics. Under different circumstances, Chuck might have found him likable. But as they talked, Chuck also recognized signs of growing paranoia and stress. Kozlov frequently checked his watch and seemed distracted by concerns Chuck couldn't identify. The hostage situation was clearly weighing heavily on his mind. "You know," Kozlov said as they toured the facility's upper levels, "in my country we have saying, trust but verify. In this business, verification is very important." Chuck felt a chill of apprehension, but maintained his casual demeanor. "What do you mean?" Kozlov stopped walking and turned to face Chuck directly. "I mean that famous American actor arriving here at same time as international pressure about hostage situation seems like remarkable coincidence." Chuck's training with Bob Henderson had included lessons about maintaining cover under pressure. He looked confused rather than nervous. "Hostage situation? I don't understand." "Perhaps you don't," Kozlov replied, studying Chuck's face carefully. "Or perhaps Hollywood has taught you to be a very good actor." The tension in the room increased. Dramatically, Chuck realized that his cover story might be unraveling, but he had to continue playing his role convincingly. "Victor, I honestly have no idea what you're talking about," Chuck said with apparent sincerity. "I'm here to scout locations for a movie. If there's some kind of political situation happening, maybe I should leave." Kozlov continued watching Chuck for several long seconds, then seemed to reach a decision. No, forgive me. Sometimes I become too suspicious. This job makes you paranoid about everyone." Chuck felt some of the tension ease, but he knew he was walking on increasingly thin ice. Kozlov's instincts were clearly excellent, and maintaining the deception would become more difficult as time passed. That evening, as Chuck was shown to a guest room, he activated his communication device during a moment when no guards were watching. Sterling's voice came through the tiny earpiece, barely audible. "Status report," Sterling whispered. "5 hostages confirmed, approximately 10 guards. Leader is suspicious but not certain," Chuck replied in the lowest possible voice. "Can you identify hostage locations?" "3rd floor, east wing, heavy security. Extraction will be difficult." "Understood. Maintain cover. Help is closer than you think." Chuck deactivated the device and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would likely determine whether his first real mission would be his last. Outside his window, he could see guards patrolling the perimeter, their weapons clearly visible in the moonlight. He had entered this situation as Chuck Norris, the actor, playing a role to help rescue innocent people. But somewhere during the day's events, he had begun to think like an operative rather than a performer. The transformation Sterling had predicted was already beginning. Tomorrow would test whether that transformation was complete enough to keep him alive and help him save 5 lives that depended on his ability to think, act, and survive in a world where there were no second takes and no stunt doubles. When the world's deadliest sniper takes the shot, Chuck woke before dawn, to the sound of urgent voices in the hallway outside his room. Through his door, he could hear Kozlov giving rapid instructions in Russian to his men. Something had changed during the night, and the atmosphere in the facility had become noticeably more tense. When Chuck emerged for breakfast, Kozlov's demeanor had shifted completely. The friendly movie fan from the previous day had been replaced by a cold, suspicious military commander. "Mr. Norris," Kozlov said without his usual smile, "I have received some interesting information about your visit here." Chuck's pulse quickened, but he maintained his confused actor persona. "What kind of information?" "Satellite surveillance detected unusual military activity in this region yesterday. Very sophisticated equipment, very professional deployment. The kind of resources the governments use for special operations." Chuck forced himself to look puzzled rather than alarmed. "I still don't understand what this has to do with me. I'm just here about movie locations." Kozlov studied Chuck's face carefully. "Perhaps. But I have decided that your visit should end today. My men will escort you back to the border within the hour." Chuck realized his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The hostages were running out of time, and his cover story was clearly compromised. He needed to create some kind of distraction or opportunity for Sterling's team to act. "Before I go," Chuck said, thinking quickly, "could I take some photographs of the exterior? My production team will need visual references for the set designers." Kozlov hesitated, then nodded curtly. 15 minutes. 2 guards will accompany you." Chuck followed his escorts outside, carrying a camera and mentally mapping every detail of the facility's layout. As they walked around the building's perimeter, he spotted movement in the tree line approximately 800 meters away. Sterling's backup team was in position. Through his tiny earpiece, Chuck heard Sterling's voice. "We have visual contact. Hostage locations confirmed. Preparing for coordinated action." Chuck continued photographing, using the camera movements to mask his responses to Sterling's communications. "Guards are changing shift patterns. Window of opportunity in 10 minutes. Understood. When you hear the first shot, get down and stay down." Chuck's hands were steady as he continued taking pictures, but his mind was racing. Everything he had learned about combat situations, everything Bob Henderson had taught him about staying calm under pressure, would be tested in the next few minutes. As they completed the circuit around the building, Chuck noticed one of his guards checking his watch nervously. Something was making Kozlov's men increasingly agitated, though Chuck couldn't identify the specific cause. They had just returned to the main entrance when Chuck heard it, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle echoing across the landscape. One of the perimeter guards dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Sniper!" someone shouted in Russian. Chaos erupted immediately. Guards scrambled for cover while trying to identify the shooter's position. Chuck dove behind a concrete barrier as bullets began flying from multiple directions. Through the confusion, Chuck could hear Kozlov shouting orders from inside the building. The remaining guards were trying to establish a defensive perimeter. while others presumably moved to secure the hostages. A second rifle crack rang out and another guard fell. The shots were coming from the tree line where Chuck had spotted movement, but the shooter's exact position was impossible to identify. Chuck activated his communication device. "This is Chuck. Extraction window is open." "Roger that," came Sterling's reply. "Stay in position. Sniper is providing cover for assault team." Chuck pressed himself against the concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire erupted around him. Through gaps in the structure, he could see Sterling's assault team moving across the open ground with tactical precision, using the sniper's covering fire to advance on the building. A third shot from the distant sniper found its mark, eliminating a guard who had been manning a heavy machine gun position. The accuracy was incredible, especially given the distance and the chaos of the firefight. Chuck recognized the shooting pattern now. Each shot was carefully timed to maximum tactical effect, removing specific threats that would have prevented the assault team's advance. This wasn't random shooting. It was surgical precision from someone who understood exactly how to support a complex operation. The assault team reached the building and disappeared inside. Chuck could hear gunfire and shouting from within, but the sounds were moving away, from his position toward the area where the hostages were being held. Minutes passed like hours. Chuck remained behind his barrier, occasionally glimpsing muzzle flashes from inside the building but unable to determine who was winning the firefight. Finally, Sterling's voice came through the earpiece. "Hostages secure, all 5 alive and uninjured. Kozlov in custody. Sniper, maintain overwatch until extraction is complete." Chuck felt a wave of relief wash over him. The mission had succeeded, and he had survived his first real operation. But as he started to stand, a figure emerged from the building behind him. It was one of Kozlov's guards, wounded but still armed. The man raised his rifle toward Chuck, finger tightening on the trigger. The distant sniper's 4th shot came so quickly that Chuck barely heard it. The guard crumpled to the ground before he could fire, his weapon falling harmlessly beside him. "Thank you," Chuck whispered into his communication device. "My pleasure," came the reply in a crisp British accent. "Welcome to the real world, Mr. Norris." Sterling emerged from the building with the 5 rescued hostages, all of whom appeared shaken but unharmed. Behind them came other members of the assault team, including Kozlov in restraints. As Chuck stood up from his hiding place, he realized that everything had changed. He was no longer Chuck Norris, the action movie star playing at being a soldier. He had become something else entirely, something he was still learning to understand. The sniper who had saved his life and made the entire rescue possible remained invisible in the distant tree line. Chuck never saw his face, never learned his name. But he would never forget the precision and skill that had turned a desperate situation into a successful mission. Later, as they drove away from the abandoned facility, Sterling turned to Chuck with a slight smile. "So, how did you find your first real mission?" Chuck thought for a moment before answering. "Different from the movies," he said finally. "But I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant about real-world applications for my skills." Sterling nodded approvingly. "I thought you might. The question now is whether you're interested in making this a permanent career change." Chuck looked out the window at the Eastern European countryside, then back at the 5 people whose lives had been saved because he had been willing to step beyond his comfort zone and into genuine danger. "Let's talk about it when we get home," he said. "But I have a feeling my movie career is about to become very interesting cover for some much more important work." The legend of Chuck Norris had taken on an entirely new dimension, though the world would never know the real story behind his transformation from action star to genuine operative. And somewhere in the distance, the deadliest sniper in the SAS was already moving to his next position, ready for whatever mission would come next.